Hey, how you doing? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net and welcome to today's video. In this demonstration, I'm going to show you how to draw the female head from the top-down side view perspective. Now, this is actually just a part of a full class that is available on Skillshare that you can check out if you get some value and insight out of this video. And in the full lesson, what we're going to go over is also on top of the top-down side view of the female head, we're also going to cover the bottom-up view, which is arguably a little bit more difficult. I know that I certainly have a tough time tackling that one. So the great thing about Skillshare is that not only will you get access to this full lesson when you sign up, but you'll also have access to all the other lessons that I've uploaded. And at this point, I have done a few classes on the female heads. So again, if you like what you see here, be sure to sign up and check out those other classes. I know that we go over the top down and the bottom up front view of the female head. We go over the front view, the side view, and the 3/4 angles, and the top-down and bottom-up 3/4 views as well. So again, we cover a lot of views of the female head. So if you'd like to get better at that and you're watching this lesson, I'd highly recommend that you check those out. And here is the link that you need to click on in order to access the full lesson. But you're going to get a ton of value out of this one anyway. So even if you don't sign up to Skillshare and check out those other lessons and the full version of this one, I hope that you still get a ton of value out of this particular video. All right, let's get started. All right, so we're going to start this out by laying in the foundations of the top-down side view of the female head. And to do that, I'm starting out with a sphere, which I'm dividing up into quarters. And you'll notice that I'm running a guideline around each one of the axes of this sphere, which is going to allow me to establish where the front of the head is and where the side of the head will be situated. And at the sides, I'm then going to flatten out the skull to create the temporal area of the head. And once I've done that, I'm going to go around to the front of the face, drop a line down from the center all the way down to the chin, and then plot out where the facial features are going to be. And you'll notice that the placement of those facial features are foreshortened according to the perspective that I'm drawing the head on. And that's what makes these more dynamic angles a little bit trickier, is that the proportions that we have learned for the head all become skewed as it begins to turn in space. And not only that, but the very shape of the head begins to change as well along with those features, as you'll see here in a moment. Now that we've done the top-down side view of the female head, we're going to go over the right-hand side of the screen here and sketch up the foundations for the bottom-up side view of the female head. And what you'll notice is we're going through the exact same series of steps here. We're drawing in the sphere, dividing it up into quarters, except we're kind of doing it in reverse. All of those guidelines are now curved in the opposite direction as we look up at the head from the bottom. I'm still flattening out the sides of it to create the temporal area of the skull, trying to capture a more accurate shape even in the foundational stage for that area. And then I'm going to drop a line down the center of the face to the chin, sketch in the jawline, which you'll notice has slightly changed in terms of its shape in comparison to the top-down side view that we did up earlier. And the jaw area really is one of the main portions of the head that is going to transition and morph in terms of its shape as the head is rotated and angled in different perspectives. What you'll also notice is that the placement of the facial features, the little dashes that I've added in there in order to figure out where they'll be positioned, are now foreshortened in the opposite direction. So just like anything else which is going to be presented in perspective, the closer that a form or an object is, the larger it'll appear. But as it recedes away from us in space, it'll start to shrink. It'll appear smaller. And so what does this do to the proportions of the head? Well, it applies the exact same effect. In other words, the closer we are to the form of the head, and in this case, let's say, for example, that we're discussing the top-down side view, we'll notice that the facial features begin to spread out in terms of their distance away from one another. But as the head recedes away from us toward the bottom of the chin, they'll begin to close up. The distance will become shorter and shorter between them. And this is an effect which is going to happen depending on the view at which we are looking at the head on. And so you'll have to keep in mind that the proportions are still going to apply relative to one another, but they will be skewed. They will be foreshortened and scaled according to the perspective that the head is being presented in. But once I've got the foundations down and I've got the facial feature placement figured out, I can then draw them in right over the top. And what I have done here is I've taken the layer that I've drawn the foundations in on here in Manga Studio, otherwise known as Clip Studio Paint. I've changed it to blue so that I can make a clear visual distinction between those foundations and the drawing that I'm now placing over the top of them. And all I'm doing is I'm going by those foundations in order to know where these facial features need to be drawn. Now, the way in which they're drawn is a completely different situation. You'll notice that if you've studied how the female head looks when you're looking at it straight on from the front view or from the direct side view or three-quarter angle at an eye level, they're drawn a little bit differently here. Their shape appears to have shifted as we now turn the head and look at it from above. And so understanding how these features should be drawn along with the structure of the head itself in these angles is going to be something which is easier and more achievable if you have an underlying, simplified understanding of the basic geometry that each one of these components consist of. So the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, and the ears, they all can be simplified down into their most basic forms. And then if we combine that with the basic form of the face and how those click together into place, because the features really do click into the face and protrude out from it, forming the shape of the face, or at least contributing to it in a large way, it'll make it much easier for us to comprehend how the head should look from these different angles as it's turned. But once the facial features are taken care of, we've got the jawline and the neck drawn in, I'm now going to attend to the hair of the character. And to begin that, you can see that I've loosely sketched out very lightly the overall style that I want to go for, capturing the movement of the hair and loosely how it'll be broken up, how it's layered against itself. And with that guide there, that rough, loose sketch, I can then go in and work the sub-layers into it to incorporate an additional level of texture. And in order to be able to do that, it's simply a case of splitting those larger clumps of hair up and then rendering in some additional tone to bring out the overlapping layers of hair against the underlying locks which are underneath. And if we can do that effectively, it'll give the hair of our characters a greater amount of depth. And depth really is everything, especially when it comes to comic book art and this more stylistic approach that we're taking to our line drawing here. Now later on, we'll make good use of line weights within the hair especially to emphasize those overlapping layers and to bring them out even more. But for now, we're going to apply them to the facial features as we define them to a greater extent with darker, heavier, and sharper lines. Because at this point, you can see that even though the line work is fairly tight and well defined, it's still light. And there's less readability there without the emphasized line weights to help us make the drawing more readable. And you'll notice that I place the thickest, heaviest lines around the facial features and the head itself. So I'm really increasing the darkness of the main key outlines throughout the face to make sure that all of those key areas are emphasized, and that when we look at the drawing, they pop out toward us and we're able to see them easily. They're not getting lost in the details of everything else. I'll also make sure that there's a nice heavy outline around the bottom of the face as it runs along the jawline in order to get the head to pop off of the neck. And speaking of the neck, you'll notice that I'm starting to add in some cross hatches at the base of the head, going down into the collarbone just below the neck in order to describe the anatomy within it. And I've actually messed up a little bit here, because what I've done is I've fallen into the trap of over detailing the neck area of the character. And this is something that, as you can see, can cause especially a female character to look either masculine, skinny, sometimes emaciated, because what you need to understand is when you start to render and define the anatomy of the neck or any other part of the head, might be the cheekbones or, the areas around the eyes, the eye sockets, when you start to render out those portions of the face, what ends up happening is the underlying anatomy shows through on the surface, informing the viewer that what is in fact being presented is an older person that has less fat and youth within their skin, because again, those tendons, those muscles are now showing through. And if you want a soft, more feminine appearance for your female characters, this is something that you'll want to try to avoid at all costs, which is why later on I will be going back and taking out a lot of the rendering in the neck there. For now, however, you can see that I'm jumping back onto the hair and I'm starting to render that out and add in the details to a much greater extent now, increasing the depth, the texture, and conveying the volume of the hair as I go. Now, in order to do that effectively, to know where these render lines are going to have the most impact and work really well, I need to keep in mind the light direction, the light source, and where it's projecting down onto the character from, because it's in the darkest areas of the hair. And if we're thinking of the hair, which as we should be, as a very basic shape and form in order to understand where it needs to be shaded most, where it needs to be split up in order to convey its form and suggest it with depth, then if we understand that the light source is projecting down onto the head from the top left here in this particular example, then what does that mean? Well, it means on the top of the head, we're going to see less detail, less rendering. However, as the hair drops down around the face and hangs below the jaw and around the shoulder, we're going to see more rendering, more detail, because combined, all those crosshatches lower the tone in those areas, making it appear darker and darker. So now we have this scale of tone, this light and dark value across the character's hairstyle, which shades the form, which gives it that depth that we want to always be trying to incorporate as much as possible into our drawings. Now, once I've taken care of the hair, which for the most part I've pretty much wrapped up with at this point, I'm going to jump back down to the bottom of the neck, select the collarbone and lift it up to shorten the length, because this is something else that I often have a bad habit of doing, and that is making the necks of my female characters far too long. For some reason, I just seem to end up doing it in almost every female head illustration that I tackle, and it does look inaccurate. However, I will say that a longer neck on a female character can make them appear more elegant in some cases, but there is a limit to which you can do that, and if you do it too much, it'll simply look wrong. So I'm adding in some subtle drop shadows underneath the fringe of the character's hairdo, which is projecting down onto the forehead. And this is just something else which is going to give the hair more lift and make it appear three-dimensional. So you can see now that I'm attending to the rendering around the neck, cutting out most of it at this point, because there does come a certain point within the illustration where if something's not working, rather than correcting it and tweaking it and modifying it, your best bet is probably just to erase everything that's there and start again. It does depend on the severity of the problem that you're dealing with, but for me, sometimes that is the best solution. All right. Now I'm going in and I'm adding in another drop shadow around the base of the face. And this is difficult for me to get right because it's just not coming out the way that I want it to. It doesn't look correct or accurate. And there's a few major muscles, such as the bands that run down from the bottom of the ears into the center of the collarbone, that are larger muscles, larger forms underneath the skin that can be emphasized a little bit on the surface, and only a little bit. And probably these two muscles are going to be one or two of the few that are going to be defined and visible above the skin. The neck, however, for this character just wasn't looking right overall. The literal positioning of it, it wasn't just a matter of rendering here that needed to be addressed. It was also the way in which the head was rotated and the neck was twisted as the head turned away from us. And so I had to correct the orientation of the neck. I had to make sure that the anatomy and movement combined was coherent with one another. And so I went back and redrew in the structure of the neck in hopes of arriving at a more accurate and desirable outcome. And then I'm dropping in that rendering again, trying to learn my lesson this time around and make sure that I'm using the power of rendering sparingly. When it comes to rendering, you always want to try to be as strategic as possible with it. It doesn't take a whole lot to learn how to crosshatch, how to create tones, but it can be easily overdone if you don't know where to use it and when to use it. When it comes to female characters in particular, less is often always more. You will tend to find that the more rendering you add to a female character, especially around the face area, even more so than the neck at times, it'll make them appear dirty and their skin blemished, which is not something that you want. And again, if you start to shade the cheekbones, that's when you're also going to run into problems and age the character in a severe way. Hey, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for watching. I hope that you got a ton of insight out of it and that you'll put what you've learned here to good use. You know, break open your sketchbook, or if you're working digitally like I like to do, then go back through this video, or better yet, go back through the full lesson if you're watching this on Skillshare, and redraw out the female head from this particular point of view a multitude of times, enough times until you get completely comfortable at doing it, because the reality is you can know every single step that it takes to get from A to B with these demonstrations, but without practice, without taking action, you're not going to be able to fully assimilate and absorb the information that I've given you here in this video. So good luck. I can't wait to see what you come up with. And if you like more comic art tips, tricks, and tutorials, be sure to check out www.howtodrawcomics.net. You'll find a ton of written tutorials over on the site, video tutorials, of course. We've even got a podcast. And when you're ready to delve deeper into the art of comic book illustration, I'd highly suggest that you check out our library of full comic art courses by the likes of myself, Ed Foychuk, and Robert Marzullo. Until next time, keep on creating, keep on practicing, and I'll see you in the next video.